Night my daughter changed the locks while I was at my doctor's appointment. I didn't find out until I was standing on my own front porch in the November cold, key in hand, pushing against a door that wouldn't move. I stood there for a moment. Just stood there. The porch light was on. She'd left that on, at least, and I could see my breath in the air. I'd lived in that house for 31 years. I'd re-stained that front door myself twice. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft that came through the kitchen window in January, every sound the furnace made when it kicked on at night. And I was standing outside it like a stranger. I want to tell this story carefully, because I think there are people who need to hear it, not the dramatic version. Not the version where I'm a hero and my daughter is a monster, the real version. The one where I kept making excuses, kept telling myself it was just stress, kept choosing to believe that the girl I raised was still in there somewhere, even as she made it harder and harder to find her. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 67 years old. I live in Barrie, Ontario, and for the better part of 2 years, I allowed myself to be slowly pushed out of my own life, not all at once. That's not how it works. It happens in small steps, each one just reasonable enough that you convince yourself you're overreacting. I retired from the OPP, Ontario Provincial Police, after 32 years of service. I don't say that to make myself sound impressive. I say it because it's relevant to what came later. When you spend 3 decades learning how people deceive each other, you develop a sense for it. What I didn't expect was to be completely blind to it happening inside my own home. My wife, Carol, passed away 6 years ago. Breast cancer. It was the kind of loss that doesn't announce itself all at once. It rearranges you slowly, over months and years, until you look up one day and don't quite recognize the shape of your own life anymore. We'd had 38 years together. She was the one who kept the house feeling like a home. After she was gone, I kept it up the best I could, but it was too big for one person. 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard I'd once spent entire weekends in and now barely touched. My daughter Nicole was our only child. She'd always been closer to Carol than to me. I'd worked long hours, missed things, and you carry that guilt when you're a father in a job like mine. When Carol died, Nicole and I tried to find our way toward each other. It was imperfect and sometimes awkward, and I think we both wanted more than we knew how to ask for. She was 34 then. She'd been living in Calgary with her husband, Derek, for about 5 years. He worked in something to do with commercial real estate. I could never entirely follow his explanations of what he actually did. And Nicole had been doing bookkeeping remotely for a few different small businesses. They seemed fine. Not flourishing, but fine. About 18 months after Carol died, Nicole called me on a Sunday afternoon. She said things had gotten tight. Derek's firm had downsized, she said. The Calgary market was brutal. They were thinking about coming back to Ontario, being closer to family. She didn't ask directly. Nicole never asked for anything directly, but the implication was there. I said yes before she finished the sentence. Looking back, I want to be honest with myself. I wanted them there. I was lonely in a way that was starting to feel permanent. I thought having Nicole in the house would feel like getting some small piece of Carol back. That's a lot of weight to put on a person. I understand that now. They moved in on a Saturday in March. I'd repainted the guest room. I'd cleared half the closets. I'd stocked the fridge with things Nicole had liked as a kid, which made me feel foolish, but I did it anyway. The first few weeks were genuinely good. Nicole cooked a few times. We watched hockey. Derek was quiet. He'd always been reserved with me, and I'd always found it a little hard to read him, but he seemed comfortable, seemed grateful. I told myself this was going to work. The first shift was small. So small I almost didn't catch it. We were eating dinner about a month in, and Derek mentioned that his home office setup wasn't ideal in the guest room. The light was wrong, he said. Too much glare. He asked, casually, if he might use the den on the main floor during the day. The den had been mine. My books were in there. My files, the photo of Carol and me at Algonquin Park, the summer before she got sick. I used it every day. I said, of course. I don't know why I said of course. It happened too fast. He'd phrased it so reasonably, and Nicole had looked at me with this expression. Not quite pleading, but something like it. and I'd said, of course, and that was that. He moved his things in the next morning. My things migrated slowly to the basement. I want to be precise about this because I think the pace of it matters. It wasn't a single demand. It was a long series of small adjustments, each one just polite enough that refusing would have seemed petty. The den became Derek's office. Then my TV setup in the living room got replaced because theirs was newer. Then Nicole mentioned, gently, that they found it hard to sleep with the noise from the furnace room, which was right beside the guest room. Would I mind if they took the primary bedroom? More space for them both, she said. I could have the guest room. Same size, she said. Almost the same. I moved into the guest room I'd freshly painted for them. I'm not going to claim I didn't feel it. I felt it, but I kept explaining it away. They were struggling. I had more than I needed. I was their family. Carol would have wanted me to help. Carol would have wanted no such thing, and I knew that even as I thought it, the question I kept not asking myself was simple. If they were grateful, why did nothing ever feel like gratitude? Derek stopped saying much to me at all by that summer. He had a way of being in a room with you and making you feel like the guest. Nicole had gotten busier, or said she had, and when I tried to have a real conversation with her, she had a habit of checking her phone partway through. I'd see her look at the screen and then back at me with a slightly reset expression, like she'd had to remember where we were. I started spending more time in the backyard, then more time in the basement. In September, Nicole came to find me down there one evening. I was watching the news on a small television I'd set up beside the water heater. She stood on the stairs and said, "And I want to get the words right because I've thought about them a lot since," she said. "Dad, we actually need that space down here. Derek's been talking to some people about a side project, and he needs room to spread out. Would you be okay taking the storage room? Just for a while. We'll get it set up properly." The storage room was a room with no window and a particle board door. I looked at her standing there on the stairs, and I tried to find in her face the girl who'd made me a card every Father's Day with drawings of our dog on it. I couldn't quite find her. I said I'd think about it. She said, "Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd understand," and went back upstairs before I'd given any answer at all. I didn't move into the storage room, but I also didn't say no clearly enough, and that ambiguity cost me. Over the following weeks, my things began appearing near the storage room. My remaining boxes, my winter coats, the bins I'd left near the furnace. As though the decision had already been made and we were just waiting for me to catch up. I called my brother in Sudbury. He's older than me by 8 years, and he has always had better judgment than I do about people. I told him what was happening, downplaying it as I spoke, and even downplayed it sounded bad. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Glenn, you need to talk to someone." I told him I could handle it. "That's not what I mean," he said. I didn't follow up on that conversation for another month. That's a month I wish I had back. What finally moved me was not any single event. It was a document. I'd been going through some papers in the storage room. I was looking for Carol's old recipe box, which sounds trivial but mattered to me, and I found a folder I didn't recognize. Tucked in behind a box of old tax returns. Inside were printed emails between Nicole and Derek and someone whose name I didn't know, discussing what they called transitioning the property being my house. The discussion was about timelines, about my age, about whether I had capacity concerns, that phrase was used, and about the potential value of the lot if the house were ever sold. There was also a form. It was a form I'd signed. I recognized my signature. I had no memory of signing it and no idea what it was. I sat in that storage room for a long time. Then I took the folder upstairs and put it in my jacket pocket and walked out of the house and got in my truck and drove. I drove for about 40 minutes without direction. I ended up parked by Kempenfelt Bay, watching the water. It was October by then, and the bay was grey and flat, and there were no other cars. I need to explain something about my years with the OPP. When you retire from a career like that, you don't lose the relationships. What you have after 3 decades is a network. Colleagues who went into law, into financial investigation, into regulatory work. People who owe you nothing but who trust you and who you trust. People who understand certain documents and certain games. I had one person in particular in mind. His name was Bernard. He'd left the OPP about 10 years before me and had become a forensic accountant with a firm in Toronto. We'd worked a fraud case together in the late 90s that had been complicated and exhausting, and had ended well, and we'd had a drink afterward, and he'd said, "If you ever need someone who can read between the lines of a financial document, you call me." He'd meant it in the general way people mean things, but I'd remembered it. I called him from the parking lot at the Bay. He answered on the third ring. I told him what I had. I told him what I had. I told him what I suspected. He asked me 3 questions. Then he said, "Don't go back into that house tonight. Can you get somewhere else?" I called my brother. I stayed with a former colleague in Innisfil that night, a man named Terence, who I'd worked with for 15 years and who didn't ask many questions and made a pot of tea and let me sit at his kitchen table until I could think clearly. The next morning, I met Bernard at a Tim Hortons off the 400. He looked at the folder for about 8 minutes without speaking. Then he looked up and said, "Glenn, this is a power of attorney document. You signed over limited financial authority. Do you remember doing this?" I didn't. He said the signature was likely genuine, which meant I had signed it, which meant at some point a document had been placed in front of me, possibly with other papers, possibly when I was distracted, possibly described as something else entirely, and I had signed it without understanding what it was. "How much access does this give them?" I asked. He told me, "I want to stop here and say something clearly. I am not a stupid man. I spent my career watching people get deceived, and I prided myself on seeing it, and they had still done this to me. Because it wasn't about intelligence, it was about trust and grief and loneliness and the very human need to believe that the people who are supposed to love you actually do." Bernard referred me to a lawyer that same afternoon. Her name was Patricia, and she practiced elder law in Barrie. She was somewhere in her 50s, precise and unhurried, and within our first meeting, she had identified 3 separate areas of concern: the POA document, a credit inquiry that had been run in my name without my knowledge, and the fact that a real estate agent had visited my property, for what appeared to be a preliminary assessment. Patricia said, "This is more organized than most cases I see." I asked her what that meant. She said, "It means it didn't start last month." That sentence sat in my chest like a stone. We moved carefully. That was Patricia's word, carefully. She said we had the advantage of time. Nothing irreversible had happened yet, and that if we moved too quickly or too visibly, it could push them into action before we were ready. I went back to the house. This was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Walking back through my own front door and saying nothing, behaving as though I'd simply been away for a few days visiting friends. Nicole seemed slightly wary. Derek seemed the same as always, which was to say unreachable. I want to tell you I was calm. I was not calm. I was a man in his 60s, sitting at his own kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching his daughter talk about renovating the upstairs bathroom as though she owned the place, knowing what I knew, and keeping his face still. Patricia had connected with Bernard. Together, they had brought in a third person, a contact at the Ontario Securities Commission, who had some interest in Derek's professional activities beyond what was happening in my house. I wouldn't say more about that, except that Derek's side project had the attention of people who were not related to me. The POA was revoked within 3 weeks. Patricia filed the paperwork and served notice properly. The credit inquiries were flagged. The real estate agent, when contacted, confirmed that the assessment had been requested by my daughter and her husband, not by me, and was willing to provide documentation. On a Thursday morning in November, Nicole and Derek came downstairs to find Patricia and a notary and a police officer, a colleague of Terence's from the Barrie detachment, sitting at the kitchen table I'd bought with Carol at a garage sale in 2003. I was standing by the window. Nicole looked at me. I don't know exactly what she was looking for in my face. She'd always been able to read me. I'd been too open with her, maybe, for too many years. And I think she was trying to calculate. How much did I know? How long had I known it? I didn't say anything. Patricia spoke. She was very calm. She explained the situation clearly and without drama. The revocation of the power of attorney. The intent to pursue recovery of any funds accessed. The referral to the Financial Crimes Unit in relation to the unauthorized credit inquiry. The separate matter, which the officer would address regarding Derek's professional activities. Derek looked at the table the entire time. He didn't look at me once. Nicole started to say something about how she had only been trying to help, that she had been worried about me, that the POA had been for my own protection, and Patricia interrupted her, gently but completely, and said, "That's not what the document says, and it's not what the emails say, and we have both." They left that afternoon. Their car was gone by 3 o'clock. I stood on the porch after they left and watched the street for a while. The neighbor across the road was raking leaves. He waved at me. I waved back. Everything looked the same as it always had, and I didn't know what to do with that. I won't tell you the aftermath was clean. It wasn't. There were months of legal back and forth. Derek's professional situation resolved in a way I don't have the right to detail publicly, but it resolved badly for him. Nicole and I have not spoken since that Thursday morning, and I'm still deciding how I feel about that, whether it is a wound or a relief, or both at once. What I want to tell you, the reason I'm telling this story at all, is something my brother said to me afterward. I was in Sudbury visiting him in the spring. We were in his kitchen, which smells like the same coffee it always has, and I was trying to explain why I'd waited so long, why I'd seen the signs, and explain them away. He listened to the whole thing and then he said, "You waited because you loved her. That's not stupidity. That's just what love costs sometimes." I've thought about that a lot. I also want to say this. If you are watching this and something in my story feels familiar, not the specific details but the feeling of it, the slow erosion of your own space and dignity in small reasonable sounding steps, please don't wait as long as I did. There are people who specialize in exactly this. Lawyers who understand elder financial abuse, colleagues and friends who will sit with you in the middle of the night while you figure out your next step. In Ontario, the Advocacy Centre for the Elderly exists for exactly this reason. The community legal clinics exist. The people are real and they will help you. House is quiet now. I've moved back into the primary bedroom. I repainted the den. I found Carol's recipe box. It had been in the storage room the whole time, behind a bin of old extension cords, and I put it back on the kitchen counter where it belongs. Last Saturday, I spent 3 hours in the backyard. I cut back the lilac bushes that had gotten overgrown, and I raked the beds along the fence, and I sat on the back steps with a coffee while the light changed and the neighbors' kids played in the yard, 2 houses down. It's my yard. It's my porch. It's my life. I'm not finished with it yet. There's a folder sitting in my filing cabinet now, the same folder I found behind those old tax returns, and sometimes I take it out just to remind myself that it was real, that I didn't imagine it, that the signature on that document is mine, and that someone I loved put it in front of me and waited for me to stop paying attention. I've had a lot of time to think about why it worked on me, specifically, a man who spent 32 years watching people run exactly these kinds of schemes on each other. And the honest answer is that Nicole and Derek didn't outsmart me. They didn't need to. They just needed me to want something badly enough that I'd look away from what was right in front of me. I wanted my daughter back. I wanted the house to feel the way it did when Carol was alive. That wanting was the door they walked through. That's the thing about consequences. They're not random. They follow the shape of what people actually do and who they actually are. Derek spent years building a version of himself that moved through the world by taking things that weren't his, and that pattern didn't stay contained to my kitchen and my den. It spread, the way those things always do, until it reached people who had the tools and the distance to see it clearly. Patricia saw it. Bernard saw it. The people at the OSC saw it. When you build your life on deception, you are also building the case against yourself, brick by brick, and eventually, someone reads the whole thing. What I had to reckon with, and it took longer than I'd like to admit, was my own part in it, not guilt. I want to be precise about that. I didn't do anything wrong, but I had been passive in a way that I'd dressed up as kindness, and those are not the same thing. Real integrity, the kind I tried to model in my work for 3 decades, requires you to hold a line even when holding it is uncomfortable, even when the person on the other side of that line is someone you raised. I had let that slide because I was lonely and grieving, and I told myself it was love, but love that asks nothing, that accepts any treatment to keep the peace. That's not love with any backbone to it. That's just fear wearing a softer name, the intelligence piece. And I mean the plain, practical kind, the kind that says, read what you sign and trust what you observe. That failed me too. I knew better. I had seen this pattern in other families, in other houses, and I had still managed to convince myself it couldn't be happening in mine. That's the cruelest kind of blind spot, the one you build yourself out of hope. What pulled me through was reaching out, calling my brother, calling Bernard from a parking lot by the bay, sitting at Terence's kitchen table at 11 at night and letting someone else help carry the weight of it, the strength to do that, to stop pretending you're fine, to make the call, to say out loud that something is wrong. That took more out of me than anything I did in uniform. It is not easy to ask for help when you spent your whole adult life being the one people called. But I made the call, and that made everything else possible. Patricia gave me her card at the end of our first meeting and said, "You caught this in time." I thought about that phrase a lot. In time. It suggests there's a version where you don't, where you wait one more month, explain away one more document, and wake up one day to find out that in time has passed. I caught it in time because I finally stopped being afraid of what I'd find.